The Return of Ulysses. When it began to grow dark, the rat, with an air of excitement and mystery, summoned them back into the parlor, stood each of them up alongside of his little heap, and proceeded to dress them up for the coming expedition. When all was quite ready, the badger took a dark lantern in one paw, grasped his great stick in the other, and said, "Now then, follow me. Mole first, rat next, Toad last. And look here, Toady, don't you chatter so much as usual, or you'll be sent back, as sure as fate." The Toad was so anxious not to be left out that he took up the inferior position assigned to him without a murmur, and the animals set off. The badger led them along by the river for a little way, and then suddenly swung himself over the edge into a hole in the river bank, a little above the water. The mole and the rat followed silently, swinging themselves successfully into the hole as they had seen the badger do. But when it came time to Toad's turn, of course he managed to slip and fall into the water with a loud splash and a squeal of alarm. He was hauled out by his friends, rubbed down and wrung out hastily, comforted, and set on his legs, but the badger was seriously angry, and told him that the very next time he made a fool of himself, he would most certainly be left behind. So at last they were in the secret passage, and the expedition had really begun. It was cold and dark and damp and low and narrow, and poor Toad began to shiver, partly from dread of what might be before him, partly because he was wet through. So they groped and shuffled along with their ears pricked up and their paws on their pistols, till at last the badger said, "We ought by now to be pretty nearly under the hall." Then suddenly they heard a confused murmur of sound, as if people were shouting and cheering and stamping on the floor and hammering on tables. The Toad's nervous terrors all returned, but the badger only remarked placidly, "They're going at it, the weasels." The passage now began to slope upwards. They groped onward a little further, and then the noise broke out again, quite distinct this time, and very close above them. "Hooray, hooray, hooray, hooray," they heard, and the stamping of little feet on the floor and the clinking of glasses as little fists pounded on the table. They hurried along the passage till they came to a full stop, and they found themselves standing under the trap door that led into the butler's pantry. Such a tremendous noise was going on in the banqueting hall that there was little danger of their being overheard. The badger said, "Now, boys, all together," and the four of them put their shoulders to the trap door and heaved it back. Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry, with only a door between them and the banqueting hall, where their enemies were carousing. The noise as they emerged from the passage was simply deafening. At last, as the cheering and hammering slowly subsided, a voice could be made out saying, "Well, I do not propose to detain you much longer." Great applause. "But before I resume my seat," renewed cheering, "I should like to say one word about our kind host, Mr. Toad. We all know Toad." Great laughter. "Good Toad, modest Toad, honest Toad." Shrieks of merriment. "Only just let me get at him," muttered Toad, grinding his teeth. "Hold on a minute," said the badger, restraining him with difficulty. "Get ready, all of you. Let me sing you a little song," went on the voice, "which I have composed on the subject of Toad." Prolonged a pause. Applause. Then the chief weasel, for it was he, began in a high, squeaky voice, "Toad, he went a-pleasuring gaily down the street." The badger drew himself up, took a firm grip of his stick with both paws, glanced around his comrades, and cried, "The hour is come, follow me," and flung the door open wide. My, What a squealing and squeaking and a screeching filled the air. Well, might the terrified weasels dive under the tables and spring madly up at the windows. Well, might the ferrets rush wildly for the fireplace and get hopelessly jammed in the chimney. Well, might tables and chairs be knocked over and glass and china be sent crashing on the floor in the panic of that terrible moment when the four heroes strode wrathfully into the room. To the panic-stricken weasels, the hall seemed full of monstrous animals, gray, black, brown, and yellow, whooping and flourishing enormous cudgels, and they broke and fled with squeals of terror and dismay, this way and that, through the windows, up the chimney, anywhere to get out of reach of those terrible sticks. Oh my, look at this. That's quite a melee there. The affair was soon over. Up and down the whole length of the hall strode the four friends, whacking with their sticks at every head that showed itself, and in 5 minutes the room was cleared. Through the broken windows, the shrieks of terrified weasels escaping across the lawn were borne faintly to their ears. On the floor lay prostrate some dozen or so of the enemy, on whom the mole was busily engaged in fitting handcuffs. The badger, resting from his labors, leant on his stick and wiped his honest brow. "Mole," he said, "you're the best of fellows. Just cut out alongside and look after those stoat sentries of yours and see what they're doing." The mole vanished promptly through the window, and the badger bade the other two set a table on its legs again, pick up knives and forks and plates and glasses from the debris on the floor, and see if they could find materials for supper. "I want some grub, I do," he said, in that rather common way he had of speaking. "Stir your stumps, Toad, and look lively. We've got your house back for you, and you don't offer us as much as a sandwich." Toad felt rather hurt that the badger didn't say pleasant things to him and tell him what a fine fellow he was and how splendidly he had fought, for he was rather particularly pleased with himself and the way he had gone for the chief weasel and sent him flying across the table with one blow of his stick. But he bustled about, and so did the rat, and soon they found some guava jelly in a glass dish, and a cold chicken, a tongue that had hardly been touched, some trifle, and quite a lot of lobster salad. And in the pantry they came upon a basket full of French rolls and any quantity of cheese, butter, and celery. They were just about to sit down when the mole clambered in through the window, chuckling, with an armful of rifles. "It's all over," he reported. "They've all disappeared by now, one way or another, and I've got all their rifles, so that's all right." So they finished their supper in great joy and contentment, and presently retired to rest between clean sheets, safe in Toad's ancestral home, won back by matchless valor, consummate strategy, and a proper handling of sticks. The following morning, Toad came down to breakfast to find the badger in an armchair and deep in the morning paper. Toad sat down and made the best breakfast he could. When he had nearly finished, the badger looked up and remarked, "I'm sorry, Toad, but I'm afraid there is a heavy morning's work in front of you. You see, we really ought to have a banquet at once to celebrate this affair. It will be expected of you. In fact, it's the rule." "Oh, all right," said the Toad readily. "Anything to oblige." But as the hour for the banquet began to draw near, Toad retired to his bedroom, feeling melancholy and thoughtful. His brow resting on his paw, he pondered long and deeply. Gradually his countenance cleared, and he began to smile, long, slow smiles. Then he took to giggling in a shy, self-conscious manner. At last he got up, locked the door, drew the curtains across the windows, collected all the chairs in the room and arranged them in a semicircle, and took up his position in front of them, swelling visibly. Then he bowed, coughed twice, and letting himself go, with uplifted voice he sang to the enraptured audience that his imagination so clearly saw. Toad's last little song. The toad came home. There was panic in the parlors and howling in the halls. There was crying in the cowsheds and shrieking in the stalls. When the toad came home. When the toad came home. There was smashing in of window and crashing in of door. There was chivying of weasels that fainted on the floor. When the toad came home. Bang go the drums. The trumpeters are tooting, and the soldiers are saluting, and the cannon they are shooting, and the motor cars are hooting, as the hero comes home. Shout, hooray! And let each one of the crowd try and shout it very loud, in honor of an animal of whom you're justly proud, for it's Toad's great day. He sang this very loud with great unction and expression, and when he had done, he sang it all over again. Then he heaved a deep sigh, a long, long, long sigh. Then he dipped his hairbrush in the water jug, parted his hair in the middle, and plastered it down very straight and sleek on each side of his face, and unlocking the door, went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests, who he knew must be assembling in the drawing room. All the animals cheered when he entered, and crowded round to congratulate him and say nice things about his courage and his cleverness and his fighting qualities. But Toad only smiled faintly and murmured, "Not at all," or sometimes for a change, "On the contrary." Otter, who was standing on the hearthrug, describing to an admiring circle of friends exactly how he would have managed things had he been there, came forward with a shout, threw his arm around Toad's neck, and tried to take him round the room in triumphal progress. But Toad, in a mild way, was rather snubby to him, remarking gently as he disengaged himself, "Badger was the mastermind. The mole and the water rat bore the brunt of the fighting. I merely served in the ranks and did little or nothing." Sounds like Toad's a little more humble these days. The animals were evidently puzzled and taken aback by this unexpected attitude of his, and Toad felt, as he moved from one guest to the other, making his modest responses, that he was an object of absorbing interest to everyone. The Badger had ordered everything of the best, and the banquet was a great success. There was much talking and laughter and teasing among the animals, but through it all, Toad, who of course was in the chair, looked down his nose and murmured pleasant nothings to the animals on either side of him. At intervals he stole a glance at the Badger and the Rat, and always, when he looked, they were staring at each other with their mouths open, and this gave him the greatest satisfaction. Let's see what we have there. Some of the younger and livelier animals, as the evening wore on, got whispering to each other that things were not as amusing as they used to be in the good old days, and there were some knockings on the table and cries of, "Toad, speech! Speech from Toad! Song! Mr. Toad's song!" But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw in mild protest, and by pressing delicacies on his guests, by topical small talk, and by earnest inquiries after members of their families, not yet old enough to appear at social functions, managed to convey to them that this dinner was being run on strictly conventional lines. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this, the four animals continued to lead their lives, so rudely broken in upon by civil war in great joy and contentment, undisturbed by further risings or invasions. Toad, after due consultation with his friends, selected a handsome gold chain and locket set with pearls, which he dispatched to the jailer's daughter with a letter that even the Badger admitted to be modest, grateful, and appreciative. And the engine driver, in his turn, was properly thanked and compensated for all his pains and trouble. Sometimes, in the course of long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll together in the wild wood, now successfully tamed so far as they were concerned. And it was pleasing to see how respectfully they were greeted by the inhabitants, and how the mother weasels would bring their young ones to the mouths of their holes and say, pointing, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad, and that's the gallant water rat, a terrible fighter, walking along a him. And yonder comes the famous Mr. Mole, of whom you so often have heard your father tell." But when their infants were fractious and quite beyond control, they would quiet them by telling them how, if they didn't hush them and not fret them, the terrible gray badger would up and get them. This was really a base libel on Badger, who, though he cared little about society, was rather fond of small children, but it never failed to have its full effect. And that is the end of The Wind in the Willows. I quite enjoyed that story and hope you did too.